explanation for your driving. The accounts you offered were inconsistent, implausible, and plainly contradicted by the objective evidence, including extensive CCTV and body-worn footage. In particular, your suggestions of confusion, loss of control, or momentary panic were demonstrably untrue. You did not accept responsibility for your actions, nor did you acknowledge the obvious risk you created or the harm you caused. You sought instead to minimize or deflect blame, and you showed no insight into the terror experienced by those you drove at and over. Although I can only do so in brief summary form, it is important that I refer individually to each of the victims named on the indictment. They can be assured that I have read with care all of the impact statements that have been provided. Looking at each count individually then, count 3, Jack Trotter was 22 at the time of the incident and was struck by your vehicle, suffering soft tissue injury to his left calf and a significant exacerbation of a pre-existing back condition. He describes ongoing pain, restricted movement, and significant psychological harm. Count 4, John Evans, was 47 and was hit and thrown onto the bonnet. He suffered pain to his right leg and reports psychological symptoms arising from the incident. Count 5, Scott Dolan, was 36 and sustained injuries to his right knee, lower back and right hand. He was unable to work for approximately 2 months and continues to experience flashbacks and psychological distress linked to the accident. Count 8, Helen Gilmore, was 51. She sustained a fractured left fibula, a sprained ankle, extensive soft tissue injuries and bruising to her elbow. She describes lasting pain, reduced mobility, and a persistent emotional impact on both herself and her family. And anxiety. Count 10, Jacqueline McLaren, was aged 60 and sustained a fractured left ankle. And since the incident, she has experienced disturbed sleep, recurrent flashbacks, and a persistent fear of crowded places, significantly affecting her daily life. Count 11, Anna Belonozenko, was 43 and had, with her family, previously fled the war in Ukraine. She sustained a serious fracture to her left knee, requiring surgery involving plates and screws and a 9-day stay in hospital. She continues to suffer chronic pain, restricted mobility, and profound psychological trauma. Count 12, Jamie Fagan, was 26 and suffered injuries to his left arm, right elbow, and back. He describes persistent discomfort and intrusive memories replaying the events repeatedly in his mind. Traumatic stress disorder. Count 14, Carl Martin, was 24. He was struck by your vehicle and was on the ground behind it as you reversed towards his head. He managed to move out of the way, but sustained cuts and grazes to his left leg, his left arm, and right hand. Count 15, James Vernon, was 33. He was a paramedic responding to the emergency. He sustained grazes to both hands and his left knee, together with hip pain. He describes ongoing psychological symptoms, including disturbed sleep. Count 16, Simon Nash, 52, was thrown into the air, sustained a significant head laceration, 4 fractured ribs and extensive abrasions. He was unable to work for months afterwards and describes lasting physical pain and psychological impact. Count 17, Teddy Everson was aged only 6 months. He was in a pram at the time, which was struck during your driving. Remarkably, he did not sustain physical injury. Count 18, Cherie Aldridge, aged 36, suffered a severe degloving injury to her left thigh, requiring an 18-day stay in hospital and ongoing medical treatment. She feared she would die and describes prolonged pain, scarring, and being robbed of the maternity leave that she had anticipated. Count 19, Emily Wright, was 28. She sustained bruising to her foot and a soft tissue injury to her chest. She has since been diagnosed with PTSD and continues to relive the image of her son's pram being struck during the incident. As she says, the horror Count 22, Robin Dark, was 61 and suffered a deep wound to his heel requiring 10 stitches. The wound became infected, leading to 5 surgical procedures, 9 nights in hospital, 3 months in a wheelchair, and permanent scarring. He describes his retirement as having been utterly ruined. Count 23, Sam Alexander, was 31 and sustained a fractured ankle and multiple fractures to the midfoot, together with cuts and grazes. He describes ongoing pain, reduced mobility, and feelings of guilt that he could not protect his partner. Count 24, Hannah O'Neill, aged 30, sustained a fractured ankle which continues to affect her mobility. She describes a profound loss of confidence and emotional distress, with her wedding plans being postponed as a result. Count 25, Stefan Detlaf, was 73 and suffered 4 broken ribs, together with cuts and bruising, and required an inpatient admission to hospital for 5 days. He describes continuing psychological symptoms affecting both himself and his family. Count 26, Christine Zieks, was 66 and sustained 6 broken ribs, a hemothorax, subcutaneous emphysema, fractures to her fingers, and a wrist fracture, and she was in hospital for 4 days. Count 27, David Price, was 44 and suffered a laceration above his right eye, a swollen cheek and black eye, together with back pain and cuts to his knees. He experienced shock and distress after being struck by the car. Count 28, Susan Pacey, was aged 77. She was one of those who were recovered from underneath the vehicle. She is fortunate not to have been killed. She sustained multiple fractures, including to her forearm, collarbone, pelvis, spine and ribs, together with a broken nose. Multiple bruises and grazes to many parts of her body and head, and she required surgery and spent 27 days in hospital. And she continues to suffer severe physical limitations and psychological distress. Count 29, Aaron Cothliff, was 17. He was found under the vehicle and sustained extensive abrasions, bruising to both legs, a sprained knee, shoulder bruising, and a small fracture to the tibia, complicated by infection. His mobility was affected for months, his education disrupted, and he describes significant psychological impact. count 30, Ethan Gilland, was 17. He also was recovered from beneath the vehicle. He sustained a large area of gravel rash to his back, abrasions to his knee and ankle, and a soft tissue injury to his leg as a result of being struck. Count 31, James Weston, aged 40, was struck by the vehicle and suffered cuts and grazes together with pain to his hip, elbow and knee. In order properly to understand this case, it is important to recognise that the offences you have admitted were not the result of momentary recklessness or a panicked reaction. The truth, as captured on your own dashcam and multiple CCTV and mobile phone recordings, is that you lost your temper in a rage, determined to force your way through the crowd regardless of the consequences. By your pleas of guilty, you admit that you intended to cause serious harm to achieve that end, even to children. The task of determining the appropriate sentence in this case has been far from straightforward, not least due to the unprecedented nature of the incident and the sheer number of victims involved. Nonetheless, I am required to determine the seriousness of your offending, and in particular to assess your level of culpability and the nature of the harm you caused by reference to the relevant Sentencing Council guidelines for each type of offence. Also, although a large number of people were affected by your actions, I make it plain that you will be sentenced only in respect of the offences charged on this indictment. Turning to the guidelines for the offences of causing or attempting to cause grievous bodily harm and wounding with intent, it is common ground, and I have no doubt that this was Category A offending in terms of culpability. That conclusion is indicated by a combination of factors. Firstly, all of your victims were vulnerable because they were pedestrians of all ages and abilities, confronted by an oncoming vehicle travelling at speed while hemmed in by dense crowds. Secondly, you used your motor vehicle as a highly dangerous weapon, or at least as a weapon equivalent. When deliberately driven into a crowd of people, the car was capable of inflicting grave and fatal injuries, and that is precisely the risk you chose to create. And thirdly, there was an element of persistence in your actions. You had repeated opportunities to stop, but you chose instead to continue regardless. Some of your victims suffered injuries that fall within the highest level of harm, Category 1. That is because the impact resulted in permanent injury, including psychological condition, that has had a substantial and long-term effect on their ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. Examples of this level of harm are to be found in Count 28, Susan Pacey, and Count 22, Robin Drake. Others suffered injuries falling just short of this level of harm. The starting point for a single Category 1A offence is 12 years custody, with a range up to 16 years. The starting point for a single Category A2 offence is 7 years custody. Of course, I am not concerned here only with a single offence. There are a number of aggravating factors not already taken into account. You have a number of previous convictions. You are now aged 54. Between the ages of 18 and 22, you accumulated a number of convictions, including for offences of violence, one of which resulted in a sentence of 12 months imprisonment. Those convictions were interwoven with your short period of military service from which you were discharged on the basis that your services were no longer required. Although you are not a man of previous good character, and perhaps have always had issues with your temper, you have not, though, committed any other offence for many years, and I do not increase your sentence, therefore, because of this antecedent history. The offences were committed during a major public celebration in the city of Liverpool, transforming an occasion of collective enjoyment into one of fear and disruption, and causing significant and lasting harm to the life and reputation of the city. That is a further aggravating factor. Also, there was adverse impact on city centre businesses, and the offences were committed in the presence of children, and some of the victims were very young and others were elderly. There are, of course, other important factors that I must have regard to, factors which reflect personal mitigation. As I have observed, after a troubling start to your adult life, you did turn your life around. You went to university and have had a successful career within the cyber security industry, and you are married with 2 sons. I have read a substantial number of character references written by family members, friends, colleagues, and professional associates. They come from people who have known you over many years and in different settings, including your wife, your close family, former colleagues in the technology sector, neighbours, and community contacts. Collectively, those references describe you as a devoted husband and father, a reliable and supportive family member, and a person who has lived a disciplined and responsible life for many years. You are consistently described as hard-working, kind, generous with your time, and willing to help others. Several referees speak of your professional success, your mentorship of younger colleagues, and your involvement in community and sporting activities with children. These people are as bewildered as everyone else at the shocking events of the 26th of May, describing it as wholly out of character. They also refer to your expressions of regret. I accept all of that, and I recognise that the sentence I am bound to pass will have a devastating and profound impact on you, and more importantly on your wife and children. But I am afraid that this evidence of positive good character can have only limited effect on the sentence when the court is dealing with offences of this gravity. In my judgment, the presence of multiple high culpability factors, the balance of aggravating and mitigating factors, and the sheer scale of the offending justifies a sentence very significantly above the relevant category range for an A1 offence. You are also entitled to some reduction in your sentence to reflect your guilty pleas. I appreciate that this will have been a difficult decision, and the circumstances in which you have been detained have not made legal conferences straightforward. But the evidence against you on many, if not all, of the charges was overwhelming, and you could have given an indication of acceptance of responsibility much earlier than you did. The relevant guideline provides that where, as here, guilty pleas are entered at the commencement of the trial, the reduction should be no more than 10%. I am not persuaded that you should receive greater credit than that. Because many of these offences are specified offences, I am required to consider the issue of dangerousness. That is, whether there is a significant risk of you committing further specified offences, and, if so, whether there is a significant risk of you causing serious harm as a result. Given the highly unusual circumstances of this case, your general character, and your lack of previous convictions for similar behaviour, I am not satisfied that you do present such a risk. The further matter which requires to be considered in this case is the issue of totality. In a case such as this, I cannot simply take a figure for one offence and multiply it by a factor of 29. A proper balance must be struck between the acknowledgement of your multiple and very serious offending and the imposition of a just and proportionate sentence. I take all of the Section 18 offences as the lead offences, and all sentences will run concurrently. the total sentence will reflect your offending in respect of all associated offences on the indictment. In the circumstances, the total sentence which I impose upon you is one of 21 years and 6 months imprisonment. It would have been 24 years after trial. This will comprise sentences of 21 years and 6 months on each of the 12 Section 18 grievous bodily harm and wounding offences, sentences of 16 years on each of the attempted Section 18 offences, and sentences of 20 months on each of the offences of affray and dangerous driving. As I have said, each of those sentences will run concurrently, making a total sentence of 21 years and 6 months. You will serve 2/3 of that sentence in custody before you are released on licence. If you fail to abide by the conditions of your licence, you can be returned to serve some or all of the remainder of that sentence. For the offence of dangerous driving, you will also be disqualified from holding or obtaining a licence to drive, and you will be disqualified until you have passed an extended retest. Many people will think that you should never be allowed to drive again, but I must also consider your prospects for rehabilitation. I intend to impose a disqualification from driving that will operate for a further 3 years after your eventual release. The total period of the disqualification from today's date that comprises a combination of extension and uplift to reflect the term in custody you will serve. To spell this out, the period of discretionary disqualification is 3 years, plus 10 months extension representing half of the custodial term for the offence of dangerous driving, plus 13 years and 6 months uplift to reflect the sentences imposed on the other offences. Because the disqualification cannot be backdated to the date you went into custody, I consider it right to reduce the discretionary period by 6 months to take account of the approximate time you have already spent in custody. The total disqualification from today's date will therefore be 16 years and 10 months. This is not intended to be a mathematical calculation, but it should ensure that upon your release you will be subject to disqualification for a period of around 3 years. Mr. Doyle, you may now go with the officers.